you've grown up around bourbon.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
It's a bit of a heritage for you.
That's right.
Tell me about that legacy.
There's a lot to it, you know. A lot of times when I talk about legacy, it's very closely tied with the American history, right? The history of America, not just bourbon, just due to the time frame, you know. Mm-hmm. Jacob Beam started making whiskey in 1795. You know, it's just 19 years after the U.S. was deemed a country. So my family's kind of been doing bourbon since well before bourbon was known as bourbon. And really since the U.S. itself wasn't even able to legally have a drink, I guess, if you count it that way. So, but I guess the one good thing for me, luckily being an 8th generation distiller, all of them stuck with it, right? They stuck it out. And in a lot of instances, my family member was there to kind of be a linchpin for the industry to stay alive. You know, with Jim Beam going through the Great Depression, World War, and then the thing called Prohibition, where he couldn't make whiskey at all for 13 years. We started our distillery up in 120 days after Prohibition.
Wow.
With Jim Beam kind of being at the helm at 70 years old. My dad jokes, he's like, you know, I'm 4 or 5 years or 6 years away from it. I don't think I want to start up a distillery at 70 years old, and I'm not even there yet. So I just got a lot of pride for that story. You know, Jacob just coming to Kentucky on a land grant, started to grow corn, and then became very synonymous as a pretty good whiskey maker, and then that's kind of where it became, you know, our thing, I guess, versus just being a farmer that made whiskey. That's what's kind of cool. You talk about the history of bourbon or whiskey in America. It was kind of an early commodity and also a monetary form, and also definitely a great way of preserving your grain. You know, grain would go bad rather quickly, but if you created a mash and made whiskey, you could preserve it for much, much longer. So now, eight generations into it, we've stuck to it, and there's a lot of history to bourbon and to the Beam family in bourbon, really.
You talked to, and your family would know very specifically about ups and downs within the industry. I mean, they've been in since the literal beginning. So tell me about like the resurgence we're seeing now, and you know some of the ups and downs, and maybe do you have any idea what causes these? Or
I mean, again, you kind of look at it. It's a storm that brewed pretty good together. You know, you had coming out of Prohibition, a lot of people were selling whiskey quick off the still because they had been shut down for so many years. So the profile of whiskey, the longer it ages, there's more complexity that comes into the whiskey or the bourbon. There's more flavor, essentially, that's coming with that, more flavor from the barrel, which makes it a little bit variation of sweet from the sweetness of the grain. And I think at that time, people were selling young whiskey, and so it was much more indicative of the grain flavor. And now you fast forward, whiskey wasn't received as well. You know, its high surge was in the late 60s. I think 68 was the highest bourbon sales. And then it just kind of slowly tapered off after that. People started drinking martinis and things after James Bond. And bourbon kind of became known as a cowboy's drink or your grandpa's drink, where you kind of belly up at a bar and take a shot of a hot glass of whiskey and run it right across the desert, right? So it wasn't received very well. And then I think because of that, you saw a little bit of a decline. That allowed some stocks to age a little bit longer, so you got to a place where there was differentiated flavor. There was more products on the shelves to kind of offer and for consumers to kind of try. And I think you had folks like my grandfather and a lot of the elder statesmen of the industry in the late 80s and early 90s getting out on the road across the country and educating people on what bourbon was about. And that kind of set us up where you have a little bit older whiskey, a little more flavor coming from the whiskey and from the barrel. So a little more, like I said, a lot more complex. And you get to a place where it brings more people into the industry because of the flavor that is there. And so you started to see a little bit of a turn. And then once you got a little bit of the attention and people started to understand what was going into their glass and that it was an American product, I think all those things really kind of helped build in and built it up to where we're at today. Where, and as you see, we're sitting here talking about bourbon and being a big part of Kentucky history. So
for sure.
Well,
what is it about Kentucky and about corn that has, almost magically turned into bourbon?
Right. You know, it's kind of like the perfect storm is what I would explain it as. You've got a land that's very hilly, as you know, knobs everywhere, kind of rough terrain in a lot of places, sitting on a limestone shelf. That's great for water quality and bourbon making. And, you know, they didn't know that then, but that's why I say it's kind of the perfect storm. You got a unique climate that's very warm in the summer, but also very cold in the winter. So you get a lot of in and out fluctuation of the whiskey in and out of the wood in the barrel. So like I said, it's like a perfect storm. You got a great environment to grow the grain, and corn kind of grows in this environment very well. Other things maybe not so much. So it was set up to grow corn, and then the commodity of whiskey kind of came from the growth of corn. And really you see that with just the west. That's the kind of the first westward movement into this side of America. And we're talking about this side. And we're just over the side of a pretty big hill from where we first landed, right? So to your point, you come here on a grant to grow corn, and then many, many years later, your family is still established in this area, utilizing that resource very heavily, and creating a product that you kind of help set the groundwork for. Like I said, many, many years before it was actually called bourbon as a product, right?
What do you think bourbon has done for the state of Kentucky, and for America for that matter?
I think it's done a lot. You know, it's given a lot of jobs. We have a partnership with the University of Kentucky to educate people on the opportunities in the industry now. And because there's a lot, you know, I guess a lot of people probably look at it as me and a few other folks, you know, rolling barrels, filling barrels, you know, turning some bottling lines on. But there's an abundance of opportunity in the industry. So there's just so much it's given. I think it's given a spotlight to Kentucky in recent years, a wealth of new tourism because of that spotlight. And it's helped to amplify the other kind of industries around Kentucky as well. So I think bourbon and Kentucky are very synonymously linked together anyways. And then, you know, luckily we're in such a great boom where bourbon is very popular. It's being made in other areas as well, but people still see Kentucky bourbon as kind of king. And I think it goes back to that perfect storm of good water quality, a good climate to age and grow, to age whiskey in and to grow the grain that it takes to make it. So I think bourbon and Kentucky have really helped each other out a lot across the history, and right now it's kind of put the spotlight on the bluegrass state. And, you know, I'm smiling. I'm from Kentucky, so it's great to see that something that my family has been a part of and kind of helped, you know, kind of bring back and rekindle to bring that kind of spotlight back to our home state is pretty cool.
Obviously, bourbon is known for Kentucky, and Kentuckians seem to be very proud of that. But there are plenty of other states making a bourbon. I mean, there's Tennessee bourbons, Texas bourbons. What's the difference? Is there a difference?
You know, it's funny. That's probably one of the biggest misconceptions that my dad and granddad would talk about was people thought bourbon had to be made in Kentucky.
Yeah, kind of like that Champagne location.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
For the longest time, 96% and a lot of times more was made here in Kentucky, but it doesn't have to be made in Kentucky. I think the aging process is what makes bourbon in Kentucky a little bit more distinct. The laws and regulations are still governed the same, and maybe the story of how they get to their product is a little bit different. But when you kind of lock in the grain amount, it has to be made from cereal grain, 51% minimum corn. You kind of lock in a lot of the kind of stamps that make it stay a product, and kind of, I guess, the terroir of the individual area that you're aging it in would be that one thing. So you'd get a little bit milder aging climate in the northern part of the country, and you'd probably get a little bit more aggressive in the warmer part, right, in the southern part. So generally speaking, bourbon by regulation is the same everywhere it's made coming off of the still. I'm kind of going back to the clear side. And then as you see the aged spirit, that's kind of where the distinction can really become differentiated between the product is how it's aged across the different states.
What about the water? I hear a lot of Kentuckians claim it's the limestone water.
And that's a lot of it. So we're sitting on a limestone shelf, And so what limestone does is it adds nutrients into the water as it is naturally filtering it. Those nutrients help remove iron, which can inhibit things and put an off appearance to your product or to your fermentation tank. So removal of iron, but also those nutrients can help aid fermentation or help yeast growth in fermentation. And so kind of get a little bit of a double thing there of why the water here in Kentucky, and it's very soft, or I would say it's not hard water, it's a lot softer than other regions as well. And so that bodes well on piping and things like that when you're heating and cooling water. So
Sure.
The water here definitely has a great impact, or definitely is a great asset for us here in Kentucky in bourbon making.
Are we still using the same recipes? Are we still using the same processes from 150 years ago?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that change, with technology coming in. When I first started, I had an opportunity to train with a fellow that my granddad trained probably 53 years ago now. And back then, the automation was nothing really, right? So he would show me on the computer, we type in the temperature we want to adjust to or the steam pressure we want, and the system adjusts for us. And he'd say, now come with me, I want to show you something. And we walk out, and our still goes up kind of through the floor grating, and he said, you see the hole cut out in the grating all the way up there to the top? I said, yeah. He said, now back when your granddaddy was teaching me, there was a gauge down here and basically a chain, and you would have to pull the chain to adjust those temperatures and flows and steam pressures manually, and then watch that manually versus sitting and monitoring. So then you would do that, and then other things would change. So we can today click on computers and get through a lot of our process much simpler. So a lot of that has changed. But for us, Jim Beam captured the yeast that we use just after Prohibition when he started back up. He thought so much of that yeast strain that he drove it home every evening. We have never kind of had ours sequenced. It's our yeast strain. We still propagate it on site. Still very sacred. I don't take it home every day because we've got refrigeration now, right? So I trust my operators and my distillery team that they won't leave the refrigerator door open when they get their spaghetti out. No, we've got a real fridge for it, but you know what I mean. We've got the refrigeration, but I do from time to time, if we make a nice, good, healthy yeast strain, yeast batch, I'll bring my little jug from home and fill it back up and take it home. That way, you never know, just in case.
Sure.
There's a lot of things like that we do hold true, but some technology has helped us from safety aspects and quality and consistency.
Besides the yeast, is the recipe basically the same? Using the same corn amount?
Same corn, same rye and malted barley. That's the three ingredients we use. So corn, a lot of abundance of flavor, a lot of sugar, a lot of starch that can be converted to sugar. We use malted barley basically for the enzymatic activity. So the enzymes, alpha and beta amylase, convert those starches into fermentable sugar. And then when we add that yeast eats the sugar and then produces alcohol. So we still, that's the kind of, kind of natural fermentation way, or natural way of converting starch to sugar. Yeah. We still do that.
And that's what you call the sour mash?
No, so then what the sour mash is, after you've distilled that, we use a portion of that back into the process.
Okay.
It helps to regulate pH and control acidity. And there's also some sugars and maybe even starch conversion you didn't grab that you kind of get another chance at.
Was that thought about from James Crowe?
That's correct. Well, it kind of gets kind of debatable, but I've always been told that Dr. Crowe was the one that created the sour mash process. Other people say there's other folks that did it, but as far as I've been told, that's where it was landed from my grandfather. Yeah. When you got a family as deep as ours, there's a lot of things that kind of get passed down, and maybe who the reference point is, we don't necessarily know, but if it gets passed down, there's probably some truth to it.
A lot of oral tradition.
That's
folklore.
Right. That's exactly right.
Every distillery probably wants to have their own kind of angle on that.
Absolutely. And you think too, I'm sure every distillery wished they had better documentation of the history. There's a lot of oral history that's been passed down, but not a lot of documented history, I guess.
This video is inspired by our PBS series, Reconnecting Roots. Connect with me, Gabe McCauley, and Reconnecting Roots by visiting reconnectingroots.com, where you'll discover music, blogs, behind the scenes, our podcast, and more. Join our email list and never miss a beat.